Good afternoon. Well, with the Workers' Day celebrations around the country beginning to wind down a little bit, there's still important conversations around how the rights given to workers have changed over the last 30 years and what struggles still need to be fought in an era in which the role of work is changing dramatically. If you look at how the Labour Relations Act also really changed the playing field in our country, you can see how workers' lives have improved. But there are still huge problems with people who are often employed illegally or informally. They're asked to do something and sometimes are abused by people who technically are employing them. Professor Lucien van der Walt is the director of the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit at Rhodes University. Professor, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. I think there are probably still people in the workplace today, maybe still in the mining sector, who remember how difficult it was to strike in the 1980s. Life for workers really has changed.
Oh, yes. I mean, you know, one of the big things about the democratic breakthrough in the 1990s was a massive expansion of trade union rights. I mean, historically, we had a situation where rights were differentiated by race. So it's really only in around about 1979, 1981 that Black African workers get trade union rights in the sense of the right to strike, the right to access full collective bargaining. But even then, until 1995, huge chunks of the economy are excluded. Agriculture, domestic work, many state industries, and a wide range of things dubbed essential services. So at a time when a lot of the world was rolling back trade union rights, South African workers actually made massive, massive gains. And when we add to that things like the Basic Conditional Employment Act, Employment Equity Act, and so on, yeah, massive gains, massive gains.
So those gains have been made and are probably entrenched. I know that, you know, we're in an election era and there'll be some people who may receive more votes from employers who will talk about rolling back some of that, and there'll be some people who maybe receive most of their votes from workers and kind of want to threaten that that will happen. Do you think those rights have become so entrenched they'll never change, or could some of those rights be rolled back?
Well, I think the one thing is that rights are always exist in relation to the balance of power. So one of the reasons South Africa in the early 90s gets these massive advances for workers is that the trade unions are very, very powerful at that time. And we often forget this. We often look back in history as if everything was done by the ANC or the Communist Party or whoever. But the trade unions entered the 1990s in South Africa as one of the fastest growing labor movements in the world, but they had alliances with community groups. They had a massive authority in society. COSATU led other unions in a 2-day strike, which closed the country in 91 over the VAT going up by about 2%. Now, unions are much weaker. They still cover a lot of workers, but they're very fragmented. They don't really have a clear solution in many cases to the challenges facing labor. And there's a lot of infighting going on. So that's a major challenge for the rights and the ability to have them entrenched. The other thing is there's actually quite a lot of workarounds. And one of the things unions have really struggled with is many employers hire people on what we'd think of as a more precarious basis. So shorter term work, contracts, subcontracting out work, so you're at the same workplace, but you're not under the same employer. So you can have a supermarket essentially contracting out packing, security, cooking, cleaning, and so on. So there's 6, 7 employers in that supermarket. Who do you bargain with? And the unions have really struggled with that. So on the one side, I think the unions are weaker, and that's a bit of a threat. On the other side, there are a lot of workarounds around the labor law.
Are we seeing also a really big difference between people who are employed in unions in the public sector? And you see often that, you know, the unions in the public sector, so in our country at the moment, teachers' unions, nursing unions, for example, are very, very strong. And unions in the private sector, even though NUMSA is the biggest union in the country, that in the private sector, unions don't seem to be as strong as they used to be. Now, does that have big consequences for the actual working conditions of workers?
Look, I think it does. A lot of the union movement in the early 90s was very much driven by private sector, blue-collar unions. So the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, and NUMSA, the Metal Workers Union, these were really the big engines of COSATU. And They've both taken a lot of hits. I mean, NUM is, I think, it's under 150,000. It used to be near 400,000. And it actually acts as a bit of a halfway station for smaller unions. So there's building workers inside it, there's metal workers inside it. What has this meant is that well over half of COSATU members, and we're just talking about COSATU, but the pattern is actually similar for other federations, SOFTU, FEDUSA, are people in the state sector, and a significant amount of those people are white collar. Now, this is a bit of a divide in the working class, but it creates, maybe more importantly, a different type of challenge. If you're on strike in the private sector, you are pretty much in confrontation with an employer, and it's really a bit of a two-party relationship. And you can put pressure on the employer by disrupting production and profits. But if you're on strike at, say, a hospital, it gets very, very messy. There is no direct hit on the hospital administrator or the Minister of Health if the hospital's not working. It's bad. It's a bad look. It's bad PR. But you're not able to leverage the same power you would if you were, for example, closing down a Ford factory. The second thing is there's three parties involved here, which is the consumer. And in many cases, this means you will have you have had cases where, for example, nurses blockade the entrance to a hospital. Now, the people that are affected, these are state sector hospitals almost always, are other working class people. And this creates a bit of a divide. So in the 80s, 90s, COSATU in particular was very good at bringing together the community, broadly speaking, township communities, but other civil society sectors and the trade unions. But if you mismanage the situation in the state sector, for example, in hospitals, you can end up fighting against the public as well as the employer. And I think this has done unions quite a lot of damage to their standing in society. I'm not saying it's an inevitable thing, but I think that's an unintended and not very well handled outcome of the shift in union membership towards the state sector.
I mean, Professor, you remind me of a quote, and I haven't been able to look it up but while we've been talking, but just off the top of my head, Gwede Mantashe, when he was Secretary General of the ANC during a strike by the South African Democratic Teachers Union, told their members that it was fine for them because SAT2 members' children were at sort of former Model C schools or suburban schools and so weren't affected by the strike. I mean, in a way, that illustrates what you're talking about, this sort of gap between unionized workers in the public sector space and actually the people who are supposed to receive the services from those workers.
And I don't think it's a necessary gap. I mean, I think it can be dealt with quite creatively. For example, a strike in a hospital would be able to often rally a lot of support, especially among township-based workers and poorer people, if you included in your demands things like better services at the hospital, more staff in the casualty ward. Things like that would benefit workers, but they would also win over a lot of people in the community. Similarly, if you have a strike in schools and you focus only on wages and conditions, you're opening yourself up to people like Gwede Mantashe to say, oh, these unions are selfish and so on and that. I don't think they're selfish, but they create a huge problem for themselves. But if you link that to, say, we demand that historically black township schools are given science labs, and this is a non-negotiable demand from the union, you'd be able to win over a lot of support from parents. So I think there is a solution, but I think generally it points to a thing where a lot of unions are really struggling in a way they didn't used to in the past to move beyond simply collective bargaining. Because the thing that I was mentioning earlier with COSATU, it didn't enter the 1990s as a trade union movement that was all about wages, pensions, and the minutiae of overtime payments. It was a union that was raising a wide range of democratic demands. The ANC's Reconstruction Development Program, the RDP, actually came from COSATU, and that included demands, a million houses, mass job creation, massive upskilling. So it is possible for unions to cross those gaps, but they're often not doing it. And I think that's a political problem, fundamentally. What do you do? And it's not unique to our unions.
I mean, I suppose in a way, I can't remember the exact dates, but I think in the 1950s and 60s there was a split in the union movement at the time. Some unions just wanted to campaign for basically better working conditions and more money for their members, and some wanted to be explicitly political, end apartheid, essentially. And that's, in the end, lots of things happened during that time, but COSATU was really about that from the mid-1980s onwards. We don't have that at the moment, do we? And then this is the issue that you're basically pointing to, is that I think in a country where unemployment is now so high, and this points to something else you were talking about earlier, when unions are concentrating only on their own members, the 10, 11, 12 million people who would be desperate for any job, look at those union leaders and don't quite understand what they're on about.
And look, it's a thing you can see quite clearly now, where in the 1980s, 1990s, a lot of students in universities, high schools, were very, very supportive of and enthusiastic about COSATU. And I know people who were student activists and whose main aim was to graduate into COSATU and take the struggle forward in that way. But now where you have unemployment concentrated among young Black people in particular, and unions are often representing slightly older people, and this can overlap also with people live and so on, that gap emerges. Now, COSATU says it is for the whole working class, and I don't think we can doubt that. That is historically how it's seen itself. It has not been a bread and butter union, and the same is true of SOFTU, which shares that position with COSATU. But unless the unions can find a way to reach out to the unemployed, that gap will continue. Now, in the past, unions have done this in two ways. One, directly organizing the unemployed. So COSATU in the 1980s actually had a union for the unemployed. And it's really a mind-boggling thing to think about. But they had an unemployed workers coordinating committee. And the idea was to organize an unemployed people's movement that would demand jobs. Because it's actually easier to organize people at work that brought together at regular hours and so on. It's very, very difficult to organize the long-term unemployed. So that was one thing, but that has kind of fallen off the menu for COSATU and for SOFTU for that matter, and for any other federation in the country, really. The other thing was trying to put in place policies and push government to implement policies that would help the unemployed. Now, COSATU has tried to do this. They've tried to get government to be more involved in job creation and so on. But generally that hasn't worked, as we know, and as you pointed out. The South African economy has got massive unemployment. It didn't start with the ANC, it preceded it. But I was looking at figures earlier. In 1990, 50% of people in the economically active population had jobs. By 2012, 40%. So there's this massive army of the unemployed, but they're not even being used to replace workers. They have been rendered almost surplus in our current growth path. So we have a huge number of youth who are not in education, they're not in employment, they're not in training. You have a huge number of middle-aged workers who laid off, they get their pension, they burn through it because they're desperate, they don't have other assets. I think the unions would need to think about what they do. Like I said, they don't directly organize the unemployed, and the policies they've advocated to the government to help the unemployed have also not really worked. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but what it means is, in a way, that the working class is always very fragmented, but it's very fragmented now because you have the employed and the unemployed. And then you have the unions themselves actually quite bitterly split in a range of ways. And to the extent that the unions, different union federations grow and shrink and ebb and flow, they're very often fishing in the same pool. So what we see is the absolute number of people in unions isn't changing much. There's more people working, but the absolute number of people in unions is pretty stagnant. And when you have turmoil in the unions, it's more a case of people moving between unions. So union people moving between unions, then unions reaching the precarious, the workers in the platform economy like Uber drivers, the unemployed, so they're really struggling. They're really struggling. So although COSATU and SOFTU are political unions, they want to do more than wages, and that they're struggling to find a way to articulate that, and means a lot of their day-to-day is just wages and working conditions.
Within all of this, and you made the point how difficult it is to organise among the unemployed because there is no workplace. And I've spoken to people who are sort of founding members of COSATU, and they spoke about how important it was to be able to organise at a factory. And I would suggest that the example of domestic workers and the weakness of unions in that space really is a demonstration of that, in that they just have never been able to be organised because there is no single workplace. We're seeing around the world now almost the end of the centralized workplace. It's probably overstating it, but Uber is a great example. There is no single workplace for Uber drivers. Is that going to be a tough test for unions in the future here and around the world?
Look, I think it's a very tough test. I mean, one of the things our labor law is based on very much the model that there's a single employer covering a single workplace. And then your focus as a union becomes to recruit enough people to be able to pressure the employer to negotiate. There can be some sort of recognition threshold, and then you can make a deal. But where large workplaces still exist, and they do exist, they've become increasingly fragmented into multiple labor markets, where you have, for example, let's say a big supermarket chain will have in each different shop, one company for cleaners, one for security guards, and that's who those workers negotiate with. They negotiate, if you're a security guard at a Pick n Pay every day, you nonetheless negotiate with your company if you've been contracted in. And the other thing you mentioned are things like platform work. And I think that is a symptom of a broader dispersal. For example, we can talk about the global factory where products are assembled in batches around the world and brought together in assembly plants. Now, how do you actually do this? I don't think there's a simple way. I think the basic starting point has to be to look for what are the areas where workers connect and what are the areas where workers can leverage power, new forms of power. The late Professor Eddie Webster at Wits University, with Linford Dorr, his final book, it's about digital work. He has some fascinating work there of how, for example, these courier guys, I don't want to say they're in Uber, I think they're working for supermarkets, have built solidarity among themselves with essentially sort of stock fills, mutual aid, saving schemes, and so on. And that provides a basis. And although they are dispersed, they collect together in particular places. And they also find other ways to connect that remove that isolation. Because although they're dispersed, they actually have a lot of similar experiences. But to translate that into a feasible union strategy and to move beyond the assumption that you're going to deal with a huge Ford factory, that's very, very difficult for a lot of unions to do. People like to use a tool until it breaks. They don't always want to retool.
Professor Lucien van der Walt, thank you very much indeed.